For the day, I'd like to welcome Jason Davis.
Hi, thanks so much, Sama, for introducing us. Yeah, so you're in the session Commercial Mars Exploration, and we're going to be talking with someone who uh, has had a lot to do with Mars missions over the years. So I'll go ahead and introduce him now. Tori Bruno, he is the CEO of United Launch Alliance. And for those of you who don't know, United Launch Alliance, or ULA, is a joint venture by Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Under Tori's leadership, ULA has transformed into a competitive powerhouse that is shaping the future of space launch by making it affordable, accessible, and introducing revolutionary new capabilities to meet the challenges of the future. Over the past 35 years, Tori has developed and fielded dozens of critical defense and space launch systems that form the backbone of America's national security and her efforts in space exploration. Tori has a deep history in missile defense, strategic deterrence, space launch, and he's an expert in several rocketry and hypersonic technologies and holds multiple related patents. He is a tireless advocate for the industry, sharing his passion for space technology and his vision of a self-sustaining human presence beyond Earth. Tori's also a strong communicator on space. His social media presence is legendary worldwide and an inspiration to many. You can count me among the people who love following you on social media. Tori is also an American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Fellow, a member of the DoD Defense Innovation Board Space Advisory Committee, and serves as a member of the National Space Council Users Advisory Group. And finally, he's an awardee of the Von Braun Trophy, a holder of the Von Karman Medal, and a member of the Space and Satellite Professionals International Hall of Fame. So thank you so much, Tori Bruno, for joining us at Planet Fest today.
Thank you, Jason. That was a mouthful. Very kind.
We wanted to make sure we really puffed you up here for your big introduction. Well, let's start off. First of all, we're here at Planet Fest talking about the arrival of these new Mars missions. And of course, the one coming up in just 4 more days, NASA's Perseverance rover. And while we're all focused on Perseverance finally getting to Mars, we want to start off by rewinding the clock back to last summer when Perseverance began its long journey to Mars. And that is where your company, United Launch Alliance, had everything to do with that. And we have a little video here we're going to start off with. It's pretty much a cool highlight reel of how that happened. So I'll share that now to get us started. Just one moment. Whoop. Right. Share. Okay. Can you all see that? Or Tori, can you see it?
I can see it.
All right, let's go then.
Status check to proceed with terminal count. Atlas systems, propulsion. Go. Hydraulics. Go. Pneumatics. Go. LO2. Go. Water. Go. ECS. Go. Red eye monitor. Go. Quality. Go. Op safety manager. Go. Relay safety officer. Go. Vehicle system engineer. Go. Anomaly chief. Go. Range coordinator. Clear to proceed. Launch director. LD is go and you have permission to launch. Proceeding with the count. ALC, verify T0 set for 1150 Zulu.
Engine ignition 2, 1, 0. And liftoff. As the countdown to Mars continues, the Perseverance of humanity is launching the next generation of robotic explorers to the Red Planet.
And we have successful separation of Mars 2020 with the Perseverance rover.
That was a good day.
How did you feel on that day when Perseverance finally got off the Earth?
Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, probably about 12.
And we were talking about this just a little bit before we started the session, but obviously this was an additional challenge because of the pandemic going on to get this off the ground.
It was, and I tell you, I just can't be more proud of our people who, had the creativity and the courage and worked so hard to make sure we hit that. Because as you guys know, people who care about Mars, you can only go there once every 26 months, and you have a relatively narrow window. And if you don't make it, you have to wait.
And we're glad you guys nailed it, so that we get this exciting rover landing coming up later this week. And so that leads me into one of the first things that I want to talk to you about. As you all are happy to point out and mention, United Launch Alliance and its predecessor companies have launched every US-led mission to Mars since the 1960s. And that is pretty mind-boggling, the heritage behind this. And there's 4 active Mars missions, not counting Perseverance, that are at Mars right now, doing good work, that were launched by United Launch Alliance. And so I wanted to ask you, what makes ULA such the go-to company for these NASA Mars missions, especially now that you're starting to face competition from other companies?
Yeah, what a great question. So it's probably maybe 3 big things I would go to first. The one is what we just talked about. You have to go on time. We're the most on-time launch company in the world. We have never missed an interplanetary window. And so we take that really, really seriously. When these interplanetary missions come around, even though, every mission's important, they're extra special, and we make sure nothing gets in the way. Maybe the next big thing is what you saw at the end of that video. That was the Bullseye Chart. So there was a circle and there were some red dots in the middle. Those red dots were the orbital parameters, the insertion location that we actually achieved. Anything in the big circle would have been fine. We always like to be near the bullseye, and especially on a mission like this, because it does a couple of things. It is not just more than they asked for, it makes the mission more likely to succeed. By coming in with that bullseye, that was almost the most accurate insertion we've ever done. The spacecraft saves an enormous amount of propellant. The first adjustment or correction burn, they call it, for Mars 2020, Perseverance, was delayed 2 weeks. They could wait an extra 2 weeks for the first one because of that accuracy. And now, as we're arriving at the planet, there is a much, much larger propellant reserve, so that if anything surprises JPL or NASA, or anything goes wrong, any challenge, they have that much more fuel to deal with it. So we really pride ourselves on that accuracy, best in the world. And then, of course, the last thing is, you already said it, we have a lot of experience, been to every planet in the solar system, but we've done all the Mars missions. When this was still Mars 2020, we called it Mars 2020 because it was our 20th mission. And that means you know how to do all the special things, not the least of which is handling that, multi-mission radioisotope thermal generator, which was kind of a big complicated thing for this particular mission.
Yeah, it's. I was going to mention not just Mars missions, but so many other planetary missions. Just one that immediately jumps to mind: New Horizons, flying to Pluto. That was a United Launch Alliance rocket, and so many more that we could talk about. Well, talking a little bit about Perseverance's mission itself, one of its big goals once it gets to Mars is to collect samples on the surface and leave them there so a future mission can hopefully return them to Earth. And this has been a priority of the Planetary Society, the scientific community, for a long time to finally see this happen. Perseverance will be the first step of that, and NASA and the European Space Agency are starting right now to take the initial steps to develop the missions that are going to bring these back. If all goes well, maybe around the end of the decade, we'll have these samples on their way back to Earth or back at Earth. And so there's going to be a couple more missions there as well. Do you expect United Launch Alliance to play a part in one of those missions if you get the opportunity?
Absolutely. We look forward to competing for those. They're so exciting. I mean, this is a really cool mission, Perseverance. All the experiments on it, my personal favorite being Moxie, which is going to try and demonstrate making oxygen. There's a whole fan base just for Ingenuity, the helicopter. But the most important thing that could come out of all of this is exactly the mission you talked about. This is our best chance at actually being able to find evidence of ancient life on Mars. This whole mission is kind of centered around that. The choice of the Jezero crater, which is really an ancient river delta, gives us the best chance for those samples to have that evidence. And this could go down as one of the great discoveries of our time. So yeah, really excited about the potential for it. And of course, we're going to want to be a part of it.
I wouldn't expect otherwise. Yeah. And while we're talking about future missions, future rockets, we just heard, I believe I just saw you tweeting the other, maybe it was this weekend, about a new milestone with your next big rocket. So you're going to have a replacement for the Atlas V rocket eventually, the Vulcan. And even more notably, it's going to use engines built by Blue Origin. So this is another new space flight company. So you kind of have this combination of the two of you. ULA been around for a while, and Blue Origin, a relatively new entrant. And so I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about Vulcan and how everything is going with that as you get ready to move towards your test flights?
Oh yeah, boy, we're really excited. What I was probably tweeting about was our first booster we call the Pathfinder tanking test booster. So it's a flight booster, and then it has Blue Origin engines. They're not the final flight engines. These are test engines that have already had lots and lots of test time on them out with Blue Origin at their stand in Texas. And we're going to take that. It's actually at Cape Canaveral right now, sitting in front of the VIF. And we're going to try out everything we've built for Vulcan. And this is really an important step for us, because not only is it a new rocket and all the new infrastructure, but we did it so that we could overlap Atlas and Vulcan for a number of years, because we'll fly out Atlas. There's 30 more Atlas missions to go before it retires, while at the same time flying Vulcan. And that's kind of an unusual thing to do. Normally it's one pad, one rocket. So we're out there. We're going to tank it. We're going to do everything right up to the point where you would push the button and ignite the engines. We'll stop short of that, but we'll load propellants, unload them, roll out, roll back, try out everything. Meanwhile, we're building the booster that will fly. We'll get engines for flight from Blue Origin here shortly. And then when we're all done later this summer, we'll just swap them. And then that one will go back, the engines will be traded out, and it'll probably fly sometime next year. So we're in the home stretch. It's the most exciting part of developing a rocket. It's the hardest part, because everything comes together at once, and any little thing, can really set you back and be a challenge. People work extra hard. They think they've been working hard for the last 5 years, but that last year is really intense. And then, of course, you have the great reward of flying that thing and hopefully, knock on wood, seeing it, ascend into the sky. Our first mission is super cool. We're going to go to the moon. So there's no test flight, with concrete payloads or anything like that. It's a real mission. It's for a company called Astrobotic. They're sending the first commercial lander to the moon. That's really cool. And that'll be our first lift. So everything about it is pretty exciting.
And is that still scheduled for this year, that Astrobotic?
Yeah, it is. So close to the end of the year, their first spacecraft, they're moving through development of that. You don't just sort of show up at a launch pad and say, hey, anybody, got an empty rocket, and you just drop it on top. You actually work together for a pretty long time leading up to the launch to make sure everything's going to fit and everything is what we call integrated. So we're in it with them right now, and they're making great progress, and we're pretty excited about that.
And do you have, what's the manifest for Vulcan look like beyond that? I believe you had a Dream Chaser test flight at some point. Can you tell us about that and anything else you have booked at this point?
Yeah, so the first one, of course, is Peregrine, the lander. That'll be pretty close to the end of the year. And then after that, we'll do the first Dream Chaser flight, which will take cargo to the International Space Station. And we've got a couple more of those. Altogether, we're signed up for 7 of those for Sierra Nevada Corporation. Vulcan also just recently won a large DoD contract that will run out several years. There will be at least 30 missions for Vulcan. And in the next few years, it's that ramp up. So Vulcan will start out by flying once this year, probably, and then, 1, 2, 3 flights a year for the next couple of years while we ramp up all the production rate. And then it'll take off, and it will replace all of our vehicles. So Atlas will retire. There's only 4 Delta IV Heavies left. Those will retire also, and Atlas will be our sole platform.
Does that make you nervous in any way? Touting ULA's reliability, and that's just such a strength of the Atlas V, and that you're going all in on this new rocket system. I mean, I assume you would not be doing that unless you were very confident that it's going to work out. But does it ever give you pause, make you a little anxious, wake up in the middle of the night and go, eh?
Yes, of course. So I'm very confident, obviously, and terrified at the same time. Because, rockets are amazing machines. There's nothing else like them, right? They're just incredibly powerful. They're amazingly complex, and they are utterly unforgivable. Almost everything has to work right on every launch, and nearly anything that goes wrong can spell disaster. And if you're not tense and nervous and uptight every time you build a rocket and fly a rocket, then you really don't know much about this business. I've personally done pretty close to 400 launches now. And I'll tell you that every one is just as nerve-wracking as the first one I did.
Well, speaking as a spectator, I know I feel butterflies in my stomach when any rocket goes up. So being in charge of the rocket going up, I can't imagine what that feels like. So
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, of course, with Vulcan, we have a special opportunity because of Atlas. Remember how we talked about we're flying out Atlas in parallel and we're using the same pad? In a way, I get to fly Vulcan before I fly Vulcan. So we have been incrementally introducing pieces of Vulcan onto Atlas and Delta for the last 2 years. The avionics that will fly Vulcan has been flying Atlas for the last year. And we'll be flying the solid rocket boosters. We'll be flying half flown. We'll fly the payload fairing and so on. So by the time we get to the end of the year and we're off to do our first Vulcan launch, really the only thing that hasn't been flown in any way, shape, or form will actually be the BE-4 engines. Everything else is going to be tried out.
And well, it sounds like you're as prepared as you can be, and best of luck as you start those test flights. I'm sure it's going to be exciting. And I wanted to ask you one more thing, Vulcan related. When the rocket was first introduced, there was some talk from ULA about possibly doing some reusability, and that's the big trend in the industry today. There was a plan briefly to maybe capture the engine sections using a helicopter and refurbish those engines. Could you talk a little bit about that, and has that plan evolved, and what reusability you might be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are still on the track to do what we call smart reuse, or it's an acronym, which is the engine recovery. That is a purely economic thing. And what it allows us to do is to reuse the engines, which are about 2/3 the cost of the booster, every single time, because there's no performance impact. You don't have to save any propellant to fly home with, or add a bunch of stuff to the booster that would enable it to fly back to its launch point and land. So it's a higher performance. You don't save all of it, but you save most of it kind of approach. And we absolutely intend to do that. Vulcan is a very hot booster. Because we're all about what happens in space, we put a lot of energy into the first stage, so that by the time the booster burns out, you are almost orbital. I mean, you're this much shy of being orbital. And then the upper stage takes you that last little bit, and then it has almost all of its energy left to do interesting things in space. That means that the environments that our booster have to be recovered through are pretty severe. They're pretty aggressive environments. And so we're going to fly Vulcan. We're going to fly it several times and collect data on that in order to finish our design for how to separate and recover safely the engines. We've been working on it the whole time. We haven't stopped. And so that's still coming. However, the more interesting things that we are doing are in the upper stage. And sadly for my PR team, really our push is on the upper stage because that can make the most difference in space and in the missions that can be done in space. And the sad part for them is there are no really cool photo ops for things you do out, in the darkness of space. So you don't get those really cool videos of landing and stuff like that, but it will be profound what we're going to do up there.
Yeah. And maybe we can talk about some of those upgrades as well here in a minute. I wanted to ask you about ULA's involvement with the Moon and Mars, NASA's big program, big emphasis right now. So NASA currently focused on returning humans to the Moon. They've got some of your partners and parent companies are involved in this. We got Boeing and Lockheed building the Space Launch System in Orion. And Lockheed and Blue Origin, part of the team bidding to build the lander system. And I was just wondering, do you see any role for your company, for United Launch Alliance, in launching any of this stuff as part of that Artemis program?
Yeah, absolutely. So that competition, what you just described, is a competition that's going to be awarded here in just a few months. NASA will select one or two companies or teams really to do that human landing mission to the Moon. And there's a third team. So you mentioned SpaceX, you mentioned Blue with its team, Lockheed and the others. The third team is led by Dynetics, and we are their launch provider. And they have a really cool solution. The other guys are interesting too, but I really like Dynetics. Their lander is very innovative, and it's architected in a way that it provides really nice access, physical access to and from the surface of the Moon. No big 10-story elevators, nothing like that, no big long ramps. And so all of us get there by first having astronauts get on board an Orion capsule on top of an SLS that takes them to the gateway, where they then meet up with whatever is going to take them down and back. And so we're the guys who will be taking up the pieces of the Dynetics landing system and ascent system to meet those astronauts there. So, knock on wood, we're hoping to be, one of the teams that get to do that.
Yeah. And you envision that would be Vulcan by the time that comes around, or Atlas V, Vulcan?
That's absolutely Vulcan.
Yeah.
It's our biggest Vulcan, and it's a special configuration of Vulcan's new Centaur 5 upper stage that has extraordinarily long duration. So today we fly Centaur 3 on Atlas, highest performance upper stage in the world, and it has the longest duration it can fly for 8 hours in space, do multiple coasts and restarts, things you have to do to get to some of these really complicated orbits. But this Centaur 5 for that mission with its mission extension kit isn't going to do 8 hours, it's going to do 6 months.
And for those viewers who might not know some of the nuances upon this, maybe you can explain the reason this is important is because this is super cold propellant that boils off essentially into space, and so that limits the amount of time that the fuel can stay in the upper stage booster. But you're working on a way to change that. Maybe you could go into some of the details of that.
Yeah, sure. Well, we are. So you can use all kinds of propellants in an upper stage, but you want to use the highest performance stuff you can, because the impact on an upper stage is so much greater than it is on the booster. Boosters are important, but to give you a feel for it, rough rule of thumb, every 7 kilograms of inert weight on a booster, so stuff that's not propellant, for example, costs you 1 kilogram of spacecraft to pretty much any given orbit. But when we get to the upper stage, it's kilogram per kilogram. Every ounce matters. And every bit of performance you can get from the propellant, something we call ISP, is absolutely critical. So we fly only cryogenic upper stages. We fly the most energetic propellants practically available today, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And that's what our upper stage is. And as cold as they are, almost minus 300 F on one, 423 on the other, space is still too hot. And they boil away. And that's generally what limits your life on an upper stage, is how long you can hang on to these propellants. Now, obviously, everything is sized around that. So the batteries will run down next if they didn't, and so on. But it's really the propellant that sets that life. We have developed a bunch of technologies as part of a concept program we called ACES, which Centaur 5 is kind of like the son of ACES in a way, that allows us to extend that enormously. This is a 450 times duration extension of life, just what we're going to do for Dynetics on that lunar mission. We can take it further than that. So there's all kinds of things involved, special insulations. There's special ways you design the structure so that there is no path for heat to enter the tanks. There are things I'm not going to tell you about.
Or you'd have to kill me. Yes.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. We can go longer than that.
Yeah. And so for a mission like this Dynetics orbiter, taking it out to the gateway where astronauts would get on it, you take it to the surface of the moon. What does the upper stage do? What does this, you said like 6 months, like what does it do? Can it like hang out near the gateway, or does it go into a different orbit and then it can pick something up later? Or what kind of uses do you have for that technology?
Oh, what a great question. So on the initial missions, it's going to be a one-way trip for the booster. We'll take the equipment out there and we'll drop them off, and that upper stage will be done, and it'll go to a safe place where it's not going to create space junk, and it'll be finished. But that's not the long-range vision. The long-range vision is storing propellant near the gateway so that we can refuel this and continue that mission and do other things. This is the other kind of reusability that I alluded to a few minutes ago. The first kind, when we talk about boosters, it's just about trying to keep the price down and to continue to be price competitive in your marketplace, which is important. Nothing wrong with that. But this kind of reusability does that and more. It actually enables entirely different kinds of missions. Think about it. You've got this giant rocket stage up there that if you can refuel it and extend its life, you can do other missions entirely. And now we start thinking about a through space transportation system, not just a to space. So that's also part of the Dynetics vision, is to have these depots, if you will, in the ability to do these other things that you were just imagining.
Well, let's talk about some of those depots, because the moon program is obviously, NASA keeps saying this is a first step. The ultimate goal, the horizon goal, is still Mars. We want to get our chops back for deep space exploration and then go on to Mars. And you've talked a lot about in the past how you really think this propellant depot concept is a key to making some of this deep space exploration possible. Could you tell us a little bit about just the philosophy of propellant depots and why this is so important and why you think this is such an enabling technology?
Sure. Well, the thing that really limits, or has limited, and is still limiting today, just briefly, is our accessibility to the energy it takes to move through space. And that's all gated by this just really deep gravity well that we live in today, called Earth. And so if you want to go anywhere today, you have got to get your payload up into space, but then you also have to take all of your propellant up into space. And it takes an enormous amount of propellant just to lift the propellant. Okay. And so it is literally, once you get to Leo, we like to say, in terms of energy, that's 2/3 of the job. You can go almost anywhere else in the solar system for that remaining third. If you had the propellant already in space by some miracle, some magic, it was already there, that completely changes the math of this physics problem. And as it turns out, I talked about, the evidence of life on another world having the potential to be the great discovery of our time. Well, the other one that's already happened is the presence of water everywhere. Now we know that the moon has got at least 20 billion metric tons of water on it, probably more. And water is very easily converted into liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which just happen to be the most energetic chemical propellants we have available. And it's already there. We don't have to lift it out of the Earth's gravity well. And so when we are able to put the infrastructure on the moon to harvest that, and for a very small, we call it delta V, for a very small delta V cost to bring it out to an accessible orbit like NRHO, where the gateway is planned to be, or other places in the cislunar system, the Earth-Moon system, now you have the ability to really extend your reach and to greatly extend your payload capability to anywhere like Mars, for example.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I am just imagining like so many concepts. It seems like would open up with the ability to just fuel up in lunar space. It's a neat philosophy that you all have talked about. What role would you see ULI playing in this? Would you get involved any on the mining side, or would you kind of show up with Centaur and say like, look, here's your fuel tank, bring it to us, we'll store it here for you, and you can go from there?
Well, really the latter. We see ourselves as that transportation network that enables all of that, right? So any economic activity, and I'm going to come back to that because I think that's super important in order to support our exploration mission. Any economic activity, especially one that occurs across great distance, and there aren't any greater distances than when we go to space, is really all about transportation, which is really all about energy and fuel. So on Earth, it's our highway and our train and our ocean transportation systems. They all work on fossil fuels. In space, it's going to be about these upper stages and these other transportation networks that are enabled by the water, by the energy that is already sitting in space for us to use. So we want to build that transportation network. That's going to enable the people to generate the propellant, to generate the mining on asteroids, to practically do specialty manufacturing of things you can't really make on Earth, and ultimately make it practical to routinely go into and from Mars. The first few trips, they're going to be the old-fashioned way. We're going to get on a giant rocket. We're going to get on an SLS, and we're going to get a big old capsule, and we're going to spend 6 months getting there. We'll spend a year on the surface. Mars will have come back around near the Earth, and we'll take the 6-month journey back again. But over time, we're going to build this infrastructure, and we'll be able to go back and forth almost at will.
What about the times going back and forth in those scenarios? Would they still be the 6-month journey? I mean, I suppose there's not a lot you can do about that at the end of the day.
Great question. So there is, but not really with chemical propulsion the way we've described. When we want to have routine human travel through interplanetary space, we do need to collapse these times. And really the path to that is nuclear thermal propulsion, which is a technology that kind of started up in the 60s and kind of stopped. That'll have to get going again.
Gotcha. And I'm curious, when it comes to extracting some of these resources, and you said ULA, might not be as involved in the extraction portion, you're more of the fuel depot. But as an engineer and a guy who thinks about this a lot, clearly, I'm wondering, with some of these asteroid missions in particular, like OSIRIS-REx, another ULA launch, there you go. We've seen what a challenging environment some of these asteroids can be. And space missions like OSIRIS-REx have showed us that it's a really dynamic place. Some of them are just kind of rubble piles. What do you see as some of the big challenges and things that we need to learn before this becomes a reality? Or is it better to just focus on the moon first, because that's a more straightforward scenario that we can figure out?
Sure. Well, we are going to start with the moon, but it's that too. And it's really two things. The first thing is to give ourselves so much more flexibility by having what we just talked about, this big high energy reusable upper stage so that we can go to a body like that and have the opportunity to have more than one try at a landing or a contact or an exploration. You know, when we do something like, or, you know, OSIRIS-REx, it's an exquisite kind of one shot, everything's got to be good kind of mission. And if we had an enormous amount of energy, you know, 1,000, 10,000 times more energy available, which we would have in a Centaur 5, for example, or something designed for that, then no longer is it so razor thin kind of marginal kind of activity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, boy, you can't beat people for flexibility. You know, you can design any robotic device or any automated system to do a thing that we understand very well, better than any person can do it. But what they are really bad at is, well, what if it isn't like that at all?
Yeah.
If you want to go to the unknown and have the agility to deal with surprises, you need people there.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to the day when we do get people there and we can make those decisions in real time. And speaking of people, one of the last things here before we look at some of the audience Q&As, I wanted to ask you about that day when we could possibly see humans on Mars. And again, as an engineer, I would love to pick your brain on this. What do you see as some of the big hurdles that remain in getting human missions to Mars? Is it still, like you talked about, some of the early missions maybe would be this one shot, very traditional style, but yeah, what do you see as some of the things we still need to overcome?
Sure. Well, the biggest things we're going to need to overcome right up front, even for those missions, are human health related. It's actually the biology, not the rocket science. And probably at the top of that list is radiation exposure. You know, when our astronauts go to the International Space Station for a 6-month tour, where they are still pretty well sheltered. They're outside the atmosphere, which is an excellent radiation shield, but still inside the Van Allen belts, inside our magnetosphere. So that's great. They're still getting a lot of radiation. They're getting significantly more than the annual limit for a professional in the radiation business. But it's okay because they're extremely well monitored. It's clear, you know, closely controlled, and they're not going to do this for 20 years. You know, a couple of trips to the space station is all pretty much anybody gets in their career, but that's how much. Now, when we take that year-long, right, really 2-year-long exploration mission to and from Mars, the total radiation equivalent that we will expose people to today, if we just went today without knowing anything more than we do today, would be about 800 to 900 times that. More than 8 times the well-known and well-accepted threshold for increased cancer risk.
Wow.
And they're in space for a year where they are exposed to the risk of a proton storm from the sun, which is unpredictable. And a lot of people don't know this, but we had a couple of close calls during Apollo where had that mission moved left or right by even just a few months, we probably would have killed a crew, because there's really almost no defense against that with today's technology. It's a giant blast of high energy protons that comes out of the sun like a cannon, and it is really, really dangerous. So we need to learn how to do that before we can really reliably take people to and from Mars and do it safely. We need better radiation shielding materials. We need ways to cope with solar storms. And then after all of that, that's a long time in microgravity. And we now know from the research NASA's done that there's a lot of health risks for that. We can overcome all of this. We're going to Mars, but we need to go to the moon first. We're only a few days away and figure all this stuff out, and then we'll go. Once we get there, you know, it's going to be about extending our ability to stay. You know, we don't want to just go to and from and to do it, you know, infrequently. We want to have people living and working on Mars who are being rotated out. So we need to be able to put shelters in place and resources in place to support them on a planet that has no magnetosphere. So the radiation there is still pretty awful. And there really isn't much of an atmosphere, of course. It's, what is it, 0.6% of Earth's atmosphere. Oxygen is trace. So we're probably going to need to understand how to use in situ resources to build shelters, maybe get underground, to have a practical way to have enough resources there to sustain that continuously, like we do on the International Space Station.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, what role do you see your company playing in some of that? I mean, we've talked about Centaur being a big enabling technology for future missions, and of course, just your ability to get things into low Earth orbit is a big one. Any other things that you have your eye on, or any future tech development that you would love to see, you would love to get involved with?
Yeah, we're going to transition. I'll predict the future. We're going to transition from several years of point-to-point missions from Earth to one where we're stopping off and tanking up and accumulating people, accumulating resources, and then going to and from and doing the same thing at Mars. There's no reason that we cannot cache resources in Mars orbit also. And so that's a big transportation network problem. We want to be the transportation network guys.
You're the interplanetary railroad of for the future. Something, the analogy, it maybe doesn't work, maybe works, I don't know.
Close enough.
Well, last thing I wanted to ask you before we go to questions, do you expect to see humans on Mars in your lifetime? And if given the opportunity, would you go?
Yes, I do. Yes, I would, but don't tell my wife.
Fair enough. Your secret is safe with me and the few other 100 people watching right now. Yeah. All right. Well, let's flip it over. I'm going to flip it over now to our Q&A section in the Whova software. And folks, if you haven't asked a question there, or you'd like to upvote one of the existing questions, please feel free to do that as we're rounding out the rest of the session here. And we'll see if we can get your questions answered. So the top question right now is, does ULA have any potential prospects for supplying rocket propellant in situ to orbit? I feel like we've kind of covered that, unless there's an aspect there I'm not thinking of.
We have, but there's maybe one aspect I haven't touched on.
Sure.
I want people to always remember that when we talk about this eventual condition you and I just described, not to mention this, the self-sustaining cislunar economy, it's a journey. First we'll establish these caches, these depots, by using excess capability on a rocket. And eventually there'll be dedicated missions on a rocket. And then finally we're taking the water off the moon and so on. So we haven't talked about that first part, and I'll just touch on that for a minute. A rocket's a fixed machine. An Atlas, for example, and a Vulcan, they're a little bit novel in that you can add or subtract these solids. So you're kind of making your rocket bigger or smaller, but even that has limitations, and the steps are big steps. And apart from that architecture, everybody else, the rocket's the rocket. And so sometimes you carry a spacecraft that you could just barely get there. You don't have any margin at all. But most of the time that's not true. Because you're not going to make the rocket smaller. Oh, it's a light spacecraft, I guess I'll cut 10 feet off of it. You don't do that.
Doesn't work that way, huh?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So every time you go up, there's a few thousand kilograms or a few hundred kilograms. There's no reason that can't be resources to be cached somewhere in space.
Fantastic. Interesting. Another top question we have, which I think is an interesting one, you can see how much you want to get into on this one, but Jennifer Gunlatch asks, what are the concerns that we should be considering when it comes to private enterprises in space, and what are new ways we can address them? I'm not sure which concerns she might be thinking of. I know one might be planetary protection, or what's the role of government regulation, but Tori, anything you can add there to that?
Yeah, sure. And it's a really great question, because we've put a lot of thought into this. We haven't talked about it, but we also have this kind of club, in a way, we call the Cislunar Marketplace, or the Cislunar 1000. And it's us and a whole bunch of other companies. And we come together once or twice a year, and we'll study something and we'll do a report. But one of the first things that, when we got together, we realized is that there isn't a legal framework around doing business in space and in situ resource utilization where it's an economic activity. And I've given a few talks on this. I find this a fascinating topic because we have a few treaties that say we can go there and get things. We have general agreement that you can't plant flags, right? So you can't annex territory in space back to your terrestrial country. So you can't colonize it in that traditional sense. But after that, the whole regime kind of peters out. Well, there's a bunch more stuff you need. You need to be able to have, if you're a mining operation, you have to have mining rights. You have to be able to say, I've spent the money to explore this piece of asteroid and figure out that there's some ore there that's worth getting out. And I need to be able to set up an operation, not be interfered with, not have claim jumpers, not have people, ripping off my investment by going, oh, good, they found the good stuff. We'll go there too. Extract that. I need to be able to have the right to own it and sell it. None of this stuff is clear in the international treaty regime. And so all of that needs to be in place, as well as regulation on good behavior. Probably the closest earthbound analogy we have is sort of navigation of the seas and freedom of the seas, where you can travel through, not be interfered with, but you also have obligations. You cannot leave a derelict ship floating in the middle of the ocean as, quote, a hazard to navigation. Well, in space, that's even more critical because of orbital velocities and things like that. You could really be a bad neighbor and create massive damage and threaten life. All of that needs to be in place. And so that's its own topic. I don't want to take up the rest of the time on it, but all of that needs real work.
Yeah. I'm curious to follow up on that. When it comes to considering these big questions on how we're going to handle all this, I assume it needs to be an international effort because we're going to have so many nations that are, starting to participate in this sort of thing. Do you see that becoming, will we have like a United Nations treaty on behavior in space eventually that everyone is signed on to, or will it remain a patchwork of, one country does this and another country does that? What are some of the complications there?
Sure. Well, I think it'll start as a patchwork. It will want to finish as an overall international set of agreements like we have for activities on the sea and so on, just like that. But what we wouldn't want to do is run to the UN this afternoon and draft 100,000 words of comprehensive regulation and then get everybody to agree, which they wouldn't, but get everybody to agree and say, okay, that's the legal framework. Now go ahead and build your first space mining operation. If we do that, we'll get it wrong. So we need to allow entrepreneurs to go there first and begin doing this and learning what it's about. Then I think what'll probably happen is there'll be one nation, more likely a consortium of a small number of nations, that will really get out in front and say, all right, we're going to support this economically. We're going to establish a set of norms of behaviors. And if you want to be in our team and participate in our club, then you'll conform to those. That will eventually become the framework that it gets embodied in treaty.
Interesting. A couple more questions here. Looks like we got about 10 minutes left in the session. Someone asked about they would be interested in hearing your comments on synergy between various private space companies. And I think that's a great question. I know we all love to watch the Tori Bruno and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos show and imagine some kind of head-to-head competition about to come to blows, but I get the feeling it's not actually like that. So maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, sure. The funny thing about the space industry, it is such a tremendously powerful economic enabler here on Earth. So many things are tied to it now and enabled by it. Touches our lives every single day. But space itself, in terms of the industry, is actually pretty small. We all know each other. We compete, which is good, and it's healthy. It's healthy for us. It's healthy for customers. But we also cooperate a lot all the time too. And we have a phrase that we use that we call competimates, where these are companies that often will compete on something over here, and the next day we're teammates on something else because both of us are needed to get it done. You can't do it by yourself. And then sometimes we're in each other's supply chains. And Blue Origin, you mentioned, that's a great example of that. They want to have a space launch vehicle. They really want to be centered, with New Glenn on space tourism, for example. But there's overlap in the marketplaces we plan to be in. And so they will eventually become a company that competes with us in that middle space. But at the same time, we're both going to use that same engine. So they're my supplier. They need me to buy engines from them. So the volume of engines is big enough to make them affordable. Northrop Grumman's another great example. They are my solid rocket boosters. Remember, we talked about that dial-a-rocket architecture on Atlas and Vulcan. They also have a space launch vehicle called Antares, and they competed with me for this big national security space contract I mentioned way at the beginning of our conversation. We actually know how to do that in this industry in a way that I think a lot of other industries don't know how, by necessity, because space is really hard, and a lot of times you can't do it by yourself, so you have to team, and it's a small community, so you end up teaming with your competitors.
A related question to that, someone wanted to know if there are any other private space actors and companies that we don't know about that maybe you find promising or up and coming that you've come across.
Gosh, yes. So first off, all 200 entities in the cislunar marketplace, probably about half of those are universities and some government players. NASA's involved, for example. But the rest of them, there's over 100 that are small startups that we think are all very promising. And one of the things we do in this industry that is invisible to everybody else is going out and looking for companies like that and building relationships with them. When you see one of these new space companies, just kind of like spring onto the scene, the ones that actually spring on with a real idea and some hardware, maybe, they've been there a long time. You just didn't know they were there. The guys who have nothing but viewfoils, they might have appeared yesterday. But Astrobotic is a great example. We have been working with them and supporting them for years because we thought they had the ability to do some really interesting things. And this small commercial peregrine lander is just the beginning. These guys are going to do amazing things in space. And so we're proud to have been supporting them all these years. And now we're teammates on this first thing. We hope to be teammates on all the big things they're going to do in the future. And there's a bunch like that. Go to the website, yank the report down. The last one we did, you'll see the list of companies. We love them all.
And what's the website? Cislunar 1000? Is that the?
If you go to ulalaunch.com and you go to our symposiums and documents, you'll find the big report that we did about a year or two ago on in situ resource utilization on the moon, really focused on propellant. And you'll see all the participants in there, our big team. And then we're going to do another one. We were going to do one this past summer out on the East Coast with our group, but COVID kind of messed that up because we do it as a workshop format. We just didn't know how to do it virtually. So we're going to do that this year, hopefully, and then there'll be another big report.
Fantastic. Look forward to seeing that and reading that. Couple more here. This may not be as much as a question for you, but for the folks at Boeing, but does ULA have any plans to enter the space tourism market? Are there any plans for Starliner to enter the all-civilian mission market?
Yeah, great question. So probably not. Space tourism is probably never going to be one of our central missions. Blue Origin is very interested in that. I know SpaceX is interested in that. And, one of the things I want people to appreciate about a good, healthy, competitive marketplace is the people who are there offering services should be different from each other. If you're all bringing exactly the same thing and trying to center your business on the same primary market, then it's pretty boring and you'll all end up pretty close to the same solutions. The only thing that'll separate you is price, and it doesn't tend to move the greater capabilities of the industry forward. You just auger in on these, what, by the way, this does sometimes happen in other industries. You auger in on what end up being suicidal price wars where you're all racing to the bottom and you can't afford to invent things, and there's no, there really isn't any innovation. It looks like there is at first, but after that, it's just about cutting cost. You really want companies that are overlaps, so they're competing, but these guys really want to do this. These guys want to do lunar tourism, and these guys want to do, commercial telecommunications. They want to be in internet and space. And these other guys over here, they're really focused on exploration or the complicated national security missions. And then they all compete with each other in all these spaces, but they're different so that their product offerings are differentiated and the technologies are different. And then when we add all of these together, we have something bigger than any one of those companies, not four guys that look identical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe time for two more to squeeze in here. I know I've seen, and both of these kind of relate to me, at least, to your online presence, which I think many people love and appreciate so much. Someone wanted to know, do you have any interesting stories of mishaps or flaws in production that were successfully overcome and how the company improved as a result? And I know I've seen you tweet about some of your older stories about like that missile that did a spinny curly Q out over the ocean, and you explained that. And so anything you want to, any dirt you want to share with us, any funny dirt?
Well, let's see. So people are probably more interested in recent things. So things more associated with, say, Vulcan, for example. I will share that, when we first started development on Vulcan, our plan was to develop a new booster to fly the old Centaur 3 that we fly today. And later on down the road, we'd improve the Centaur. And later on, when we got the big, sort of competition happening for these government missions, we realized, that's a flawed approach. We're going to have to go straight to Centaur 5. So it started later than the booster. That's why the booster's at Cape Canaveral right now doing tanking pathfinding, but we're still building Centaur 5. So now a Centaur 5 story. So Centaur 3 is a handmade work of art. It is, as you might appreciate, I don't know how familiar you are, but I talked about how important weight is on an upper stage and how important the selection of propellant is. I probably should have also mentioned, one of the reasons it's the highest performance upper stage in the world is because it has a great engine. The Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10 is the highest performing upper stage engine ever. For the rocket geeks out there, we run that engine at an ISP of 454 seconds. It's kind of like gas mileage. That's an unrealistic, eye-watering number, right? Well, when we build the tank, it also doesn't have any weight in it. It's like a soda can. It's super thin. It's like paper thin stainless steel, a special kind of cryogenic stainless steel. And it just doesn't weigh anything. It can't even support its own weight. If we built one and we pulled the tooling off that stretches it or let the gas out of it because we keep it pressurized, it would just collapse. There's just nothing there, nothing there. So when we built it, it's the same technology on Centaur 5 that we use on Centaur 3. It's just much bigger. Well, Centaur 3 is, like I said, it is a handmade work of art. There's 180,000 welds on that tank, and they're all set up and or done by hand. It takes a really long time and a lot of labor hours of highly skilled craftsmen to build that Centaur 3. Well, Centaur 5, it needs to get built in a fraction of the time and to cost less than half as much. So we went all in on automation. We got partners out of, believe it or not, Detroit is the place to go for cutting edge, large scale industrial robotics because of the car industry.
The cars, yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
makes sense.
so all in, brought those guys in. They were all excited. We get to build rockets, you know. This stuff's way bigger even than what we do, but it's cool. We can do it. Well, I'll tell you, the first time we welded up a tank, it was not what we had in mind. And so we probably spent 2 or 3 months sorting that out. And we did. And it's going together beautifully now. We've actually, whenever you build something in a factory, you plan on it taking a certain number of hours to build it, the first one, and then you kind of expect to come down what's called an experience curve, practice, right? Practice. And then you come down that curve, they're called learning curves, and you get better at it. So the first one was awful. It was not what we even planned for the first one. So if we thought we were going to use this many hours, we were way up here. But then after we took our time, we got our partners in, they were great. Our partners were awesome. And we put our engineering team in Alabama down in the factory in Decatur, and our techs were great. And they were side by side with our engineers with ideas because they built it. And all of a sudden, the curve was supposed to be here for the second one. We were way down here. So we came back with a vengeance. So thank God. So we're now building that first Centaur 5 for that launch that'll be at the end of this year. But I'll tell you, there were a few tense moments after the first one was struggling to go together.
The takeaway sounds like building a new rocket, not easy, not a simple thing.
Not easy, definitely not easy.
Yeah.
I'll give you guys one more colorful story because I'll go back far enough that you know, the innocent and the guilty are all retired or even beyond. You know, one of the things we do with solid rocket motors is we make sure that we can stop them during a launch if something goes wrong. Flight termination systems, destruct systems. And this was many years ago when a credo or a philosophy was just getting going in our industry called test as you fly. Because in the old days, it was really hard to test anything in a rocket flight environment. You just didn't have the technology to do the testing. And so all of a sudden, we were getting that ability and everything was test as you fly. We have to do everything at once, just like it would be in the air. And I was testing a rocket motor destruct system, and I wanted to test it like you fly it. So I didn't want to just cut panels or cut empty cases or anything like that. I wanted to light the rocket motor in a static firing, have it going like crazy, then hit the destruct charge and have it cut, you know, the case and render it non-propulsive and show that it works in every possible way. And we did it. I talked my boss into it, and the rocket motor's going, it's going beautifully. We hit the destruct system, and the entire test stand ceased to exist in a fraction of a second when the entire motor detonated. Wasn't supposed to do that.
The plan was just to shut off the engine.
Yes, just shut it down. We're just going to shut it down. We were going to vent it. But instead, the entire, I won't tell you how many 1,000 pounds of propellant, because then I'd tell you what system this was. But the whole thing went high order and exploded like a stick of dynamite. And it made a really, really big hole in the desert. And all of the test facilities that were there to test it, the data system, everything, the thrust reactor that measures how much, all of that was gone.
Oh, man.
And somehow I didn't get fired.
You didn't get fired, and you tested like you flew. You just did the thing. Yeah.
And we understood it and we fixed it. We didn't quite run that test again, though.
Maybe make an exception on that one in the future. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, thanks so much for sharing the good stories. And I know you share a lot of them on your Twitter account. Is your handle just Tori Bruno on there? One word?
Tori Bruno.
Yeah, so if you're not following Tori, I highly recommend it. It's always entertaining, and he's always on there answering all of your geeky rocket questions, which is just a delight to see. So thank you so much, Tori, for joining us. Thanks for even staying over time a few minutes here. Really appreciated having you. Thanks for getting Perseverance to Mars. And I think I speak for all of us. We're looking forward to the next generation of all this stuff we talked about, these propellant depots and humans to Mars, and what's around the corner. So thank you.
My pleasure. And great questions from the audience. You guys were awesome. And you too, Jason. And one last thing, happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's to you. Do you have any plans?
Mrs. Bruno and I are going to spend a lovely afternoon together.
That sounds lovely. Yes. I don't have plans, but we'll just talk about it. Okay, Sam, are you still there?
Yep,
Our producer? You want to chime in?
I sure do. Thank you so much to Jason and Tori for a wonderful conversation and sharing the expertise. It was clear you both were having a lot of fun. So we as viewers always really appreciate that. To everybody else who's still with us, during your short break, please stop into our exhibitors section. We have some tremendous supporters who help make Planet Fest possible. Click on exhibitors on the far left in Whova to see their profiles. And then coming up next is our final session that will detail 7 more minutes of terror. You don't want to miss it. Please click on agenda on the far left and choose the session title to get connected. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks, Tori.
Thank you, Jason. That was fun.